Welcome. Tonight we step quietly into the shadows of myth, into a world of gods, of men, and of ghosts that never sleep. This is not a tale of noise or chaos. It is a slow, steady breath through ancient dust and faded memories. You may know him as the god of war, but before the blades, before Olympus, before the fall, there was a man named Kratos. Settle in. Close your eyes. Let this story guide you. And if you enjoy stories like this, calm, deep, and slow, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and let the algorithm know you want more. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1: Child of Sparta. I was not born with rage in my heart. That came later. What I was born into was silence. Not the gentle kind, not peace, but the silence of discipline, of unasked questions, of early mornings where breath turned white in the cold and boys cried quietly so no one could hear. Sparta did not raise children. It forged weapons. I was one of many, lined up before dawn, wooden blades in hand, trembling not from fear but from the knowledge that fear would only make things worse. I was small at first, lean like a branch before the spring. But I was stubborn. I learned quickly. I listened. When the instructors barked orders, I moved before they finished the sentence. When pain came, I clenched my teeth and waited for it to pass. That was the way of it. Boys who didn't learn quickly didn't last long. Some were sent back to their homes in shame. Others left the training grounds in silence and were never spoken of again. Even as children, we knew weakness had no name here. My earliest memory is not of family, not of warmth, but of the training pit. I remember the taste of dust in my mouth, the sting of splinters from broken training spears, and the sound of a dozen boys grunting and gasping, trying not to fall. Falling meant correction, and correction hurt. The instructors carried long staffs, not to teach but to remind. When we failed to strike with precision, they'd lash our shoulders or legs. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. They said pain made memory permanent. And they were right. To this day, I remember the crack of the wood. I remember the way my breath caught in my throat when it struck. And I remember the quiet fury it left behind. A voice inside me, small at the time, that whispered, "You will never be weak again." That voice never left. My father was a soldier. He did not speak much, but he was always watching. At home, there was no gentleness. There were no embraces, no words of encouragement, only discipline. He would nod once if I returned from training without bruises. If I came back limping, he would make me repeat the exercises again, this time in the dirt behind our house until I bled. My mother, by contrast, was a shadow, always present but always out of reach. Spartan women were strong, but distant. They were taught not to interfere with the raising of warriors. She did what she could. Quiet glances over her shoulder when she thought no one saw. A hand brushing the back of my head once, quickly. I think she wanted to hold me, but the walls around us were too thick, built of generations that believed closeness was a threat to strength. Still, I remember her eyes, the sadness in them, as if she knew what I would become long before I did. There was only one person who truly mattered to me in those days. My younger brother, Deimos. He was different, smaller, softer-spoken, but brave in a way that didn't show in the training yard. He had something I did not, faith. When we sparred, he didn't fight with anger, he fought with hope. I envied that, and perhaps I feared it too, because hope was dangerous. Hope made you slow. Hope could be taken. And eventually it was. The day they came for him, I didn't understand. The sky had darkened, and the priests of the oracle spoke of a prophecy, about a marked child who would bring ruin to Olympus. Deimos had a birthmark, a strange red mark across his body. That was enough for them. Ares and Athena descended like judgment. We were just boys. We couldn't fight gods. I tried. I threw myself at them. I failed. They took him. I can still hear his screams. I can still feel the heat of Ares's hand slamming me into the dirt. I still taste the blood and the shame. After that day, I swore I would never fail again. I would grow stronger than any man, stronger than any god. I buried my grief in training, buried my fear under scars, and I became what they wanted, a soldier without hesitation, a boy without a brother, tool not a son. The rage didn't come all at once. It grew slowly, like a fire hidden under ash, waiting for the right breath of wind. I carried that fire with me from then on. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew it would burn through anything that stood in my way, even the gods. I was not born with rage in my heart. That came later. What I was born into was silence. Not the gentle kind, not peace, but the silence of discipline, of unasked questions, of early mornings where breath turned white in the cold and boys cried quietly so no one could hear. Sparta did not raise children. It forged weapons. I was one of many, lined up before dawn, wooden blades in hand, trembling not from fear but from the knowledge that fear would only make things worse. I was small at first, lean like a branch before the spring, but I was stubborn. I learned quickly. I listened. When the instructors barked orders, I moved before they finished the sentence. When pain came, I clenched my teeth and waited for it to pass. That was the way of it. Boys who didn't learn quickly didn't last long. Some were sent back to their homes in shame. Others left the training grounds in silence and were never spoken of again. Even as children, we knew weakness had no name here. My earliest memory is not of family, not of warmth, but of the training pit. I remember the taste of dust in my mouth, the sting of splinters from broken training spears, and the sound of a dozen boys grunting and gasping, trying not to fall. Falling meant correction, and correction hurt. The instructors carried long staffs, not to teach but to remind. When we failed to strike with precision, they'd lash our shoulders or legs. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. They said pain made memory permanent, and they were right. To this day, I remember the crack of the wood. I remember the way my breath caught in my throat when it struck. And I remember the quiet fury it left behind. A voice inside me, small at the time, that whispered, "You will never be weak again." That voice never left. My father was a soldier. He did not speak much, but he was always watching. At home, there was no gentleness. There were no embraces, no words of encouragement, only discipline. He would nod once if I returned from training without bruises. If I came back limping, he would make me repeat the exercises again, this time in the dirt behind our house until I bled. My mother, by contrast, was a shadow, always present but always out of reach. Spartan women were strong, but distant. They were taught not to interfere with the raising of warriors. She did what she could. Quiet glances over her shoulder when she thought no one saw. A hand brushing the back of my head once, quickly. I think she wanted to hold me, but the walls around us were too thick, built of generations that believed closeness was a threat to strength. Still, I remember her eyes, the sadness in them, as if she knew what I would become long before I did. There was only one person who truly mattered to me in those days. My younger brother, Deimos. He was different, smaller, softer spoken, but brave in a way that didn't show in the training yard. He had something I did not, faith. When we sparred, he didn't fight with anger, he fought with hope. I envied that, and perhaps I feared it too, because hope was dangerous. Hope made you slow. Hope could be taken. And eventually it was. The day they came for him, I didn't understand. The sky had darkened, and the priests of the oracle spoke of a prophecy, about a marked child who would bring ruin to Olympus. Deimos had a birthmark, a strange red mark across his body. That was enough for them. Ares and Athena descended like judgment. We were just boys. We couldn't fight gods. I tried. I threw myself at them. I failed. They took him. I can still hear his screams. I can still feel the heat of Ares's hand slamming me into the dirt. I still taste the blood and the shame. After that day, I swore I would never fail again. I would grow stronger than any man, stronger than any god. I buried my grief in training, buried my fear under scars, and I became what they wanted, a soldier without hesitation, a boy without a brother, tool not a son. The rage didn't come all at once. It grew slowly, like a fire hidden under ash, waiting for the right breath of wind. I carried that fire with me from then on. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew it would burn through anything that stood in my way, even the gods. Years passed. The boy I had been was lost somewhere between bruises and orders, between battle drills and hollow praise. I grew taller, heavier, my arms hardened like oak, my fists no longer soft with hesitation. The instructors no longer corrected me. They began to watch me instead, not with warmth, but with a cold sort of interest. I was becoming something useful, a weapon. My name began to echo in the barracks before I entered, and other boys either followed my lead or stayed out of my way. They respected me, or maybe they feared me. In Sparta, it was the same thing. What they didn't see, what no one ever saw, was how tightly I held myself together in the silence between drills. When the blades were put away and the helmets came off, I would sit alone and count my breath, like I was keeping myself from falling apart. I did not know what I would become. I only knew I could not become weak. It was around this time I began to see war not as a test but as a certainty. I was no longer being trained to survive. I was being prepared to command. And with that came expectations. To think, to lead, to make decisions that would send men to their deaths. I didn't resist. I never questioned. Not out loud. But inside, I started to feel a pressure building. A voice that asked, "What then? What happens when you win? What do you do when the blood dries and the enemy falls? What is left?" No one answered. No one could. The other young men drank, laughed, fought for the attention of the city's daughters. I stayed quiet. My thoughts were heavier than my armor. And when I wasn't fighting on the field, I was fighting the memories I dared not speak of. Deimos's face, the gods who took him, the helplessness that still curled in my gut like a sickness I couldn't cure. I buried it beneath muscle, beneath orders, beneath the illusion of control. I was eventually given my own unit. Spartans, hard men, unflinching. They followed my commands without doubt, because I never hesitated. That was the key. Commander could not afford second thoughts. Every decision had to be delivered like a blade, quick, clean, absolute. I led them into ambushes across mountain passes, into city sieges. I made maps in my head, read the ground like scripture, counted supplies like a priest counts offerings. They called me brilliant, tactical. I called it survival. Every battle was a chance to prove that I was still strong, that I could not be broken. I began to crave the moments before combat, that breathless stillness where every man faced the truth of himself. Some were afraid. I was not because I was fearless, but because, for me, war had become the only place I felt real. Everything else was noise. In the silence before swords met shields, I found clarity. I found something close to peace. But the victories came at a cost. For every city we conquered, something in me tightened. Not regret, that would have meant I still cared. It was more like pressure. Like the weight of every life taken began to press inward, slow and invisible. My men called me the wolf, silent, cunning, ruthless. I accepted the name. I played the role. But at night, when the fires dimmed and the helmets were placed beside sleeping bodies, I sat alone. Always alone. I would stare at the stars and wonder if Deimos could see them too, wherever he had been taken. I told myself he was still alive. He had to be. The gods had taken too much for it to be for nothing. That belief became my anchor, thin, fragile, but enough. And when my sword arm ached and my shoulders throbbed with old wounds, it was that hope, unspoken, unshared, that kept me upright. I would find him. I would become strong enough, even if I had to destroy the world to do it. Command was not the end. It was only the beginning of another kind of burden. As I led more campaigns, as victories stacked like stones upon my back, the praise grew louder. Sparta honored success, not emotion. No one asked how it felt to walk through a field of the dead, only how quickly it was won. I began to carry medals I didn't remember earning, titles I didn't care for. To the people, I was becoming a hero. To my men, I was a symbol. But inside, I remained what I had always been. A brother who had failed, a boy shaped by pain, a man still searching for something he could never name. And even as my reputation grew, I felt smaller inside, more distant from what I thought I was fighting for. That fire, born the day they took Deimos, kept burning, but it wasn't warmth. It was hunger, a need to prove myself, to show the gods I would not kneel. And yet, no matter how many battles I won, I never felt closer to peace. Just louder inside, more restless. In those years, I met the woman who would become my wife. Lysandra. She was not like the others. She did not fear me, and she did not worship me. She looked through me, and that alone made me uncomfortable. She asked questions I didn't know how to answer. Soft ones, spoken in the quiet of night, when armor lay in the corner and my voice returned to its human weight. "What do you really want, Kratos?" she once asked. I remember turning away. I didn't know. I had never been allowed to want anything, only to endure, only to win. But she saw something in me, and instead of recoiling, she stayed. Her presence softened me, not in the way that made me weak, but in a way that reminded me I was more than my scars. With her, I allowed myself to laugh, if only rarely. I allowed myself to hope, if only briefly. And when she gave birth to our daughter, Calliope, I felt something I could not explain. Holding her, tiny and alive in my arms, I realized that there were still things in this world I could not fight, things I was terrified to lose. Still, for a time, I felt something close to balance. We had a home, a routine, a space where the sword could be set aside, if only for a few hours each day. And in those hours, I was not a general. I was a father. Calliope had her mother's calm and my eyes. She would wrap her hands around my finger and smile as though I had never seen battle. She made me forget, if only for a moment, what I had become. I would hum to her before sleep, my voice rough and low, more rumble than melody. But it worked. It soothed her, and somehow it soothed me too. I imagined a future where she would grow strong, not for war, but for living, where she would speak freely, love deeply, and never learn the silence that Sparta taught me. But fate does not care for dreams. The plague came fast. One by one, children in the city grew pale, thin, and still. When Calliope fell ill, I felt something break inside me that not even battle had ever reached. I begged the healers. I begged the priests. I begged the gods. But they gave no answer. And I remembered that day, the day they took Deimos, and I knew with sudden, terrible clarity that the gods do not give. They only take. Desperation makes men foolish, but it makes fathers dangerous. I refused to watch another piece of myself be torn away by powers I could not see. The oracle spoke of a cure, of a sacred offering to Ares, the god of war himself. a gift of absolute devotion. I did not hesitate. I had led men into death for lesser reasons. I would give him anything, my sword, my service, even my soul, if it meant saving my child. And so I stood beneath blood-red skies, knelt at a broken altar, and offered the only thing I had left to give, myself. I made a vow. I would serve him in war, in conquest, in rage. I would burn his enemies, crush his rivals, tear down walls in his name. I would become his weapon, if only he spared her. The wind howled. My knuckles bled against the stone. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A voice like steel dragged across bone, said nothing kind. It made no promises, but it accepted. And in that moment, I became something else. Chapter 2, a general by command, not by choice. They say that a pact with a god is sacred, that when you bind yourself to Olympus, you are lifted, enlightened, chosen. But I know better. Ares did not choose me out of kindness, nor out of purpose. He chose me because I was desperate, and desperation makes men easy to shape. The day I swore myself to him, I felt nothing holy, only heat, and a weight settle into my chest that would never leave. The blades of chaos were seared into my skin, not handed, not bestowed, but branded. Their chains burned not just flesh but identity. I was no longer Kratos of Sparta. I was Ares' instrument, his destroyer, his fury made flesh. And I wore that title like armor because there was no turning back. To doubt him now would be to doubt my vow. And my vow was the only thing keeping my daughter alive. Or so I believed. Ares wasted no time. He sent me to the corners of the earth, to raise cities, to topple kings, to slaughter without question. And I obeyed. First, it felt righteous. The strength he gave me was intoxicating. I had always been strong, but now I was unstoppable. Enemies who once required strategy and numbers fell beneath my blades like wheat under a scythe. I did not fear death. I had become its herald. The men who followed me worshipped me. They no longer saw a general. They saw a god in waiting. They cheered when I entered the camp. They mimicked my tactics, my silence, my rage. And deep down, I hated them for it, because I knew the truth. I wasn't leading them into glory. I was leading them deeper into a hole I could no longer see the bottom of. But I told myself this was for Calliope, that every fire I set, every life I took, was part of the price for her breath. That was the lie I carried. And lies, when told often enough, begin to sound like conviction. As the campaigns grew bloodier, the line between necessity and cruelty blurred. Ares did not ask for strategy, he asked for chaos, terror, spectacle. He wanted cities to fall not with precision, but with screams. And I gave him what he asked. I remember standing at the gates of a temple, one I had been ordered to destroy. The defenders were not warriors, but priests, elders, mothers, children. I paused only once, just for a heartbeat, but the blades moved anyway. My hands obeyed before my mind could resist. That was when I realized the chains weren't just physical. They were inside me. Ares had not made me a servant. He had made me a weapon with a mind only for war. And worse, I had allowed it, because there was power in surrender. Because in letting go of choice, there was relief. No more doubt, no more guilt, only the mission, only the order, only the next kill. And I followed that path blindly, because I believed it was the only way to bring peace to the ones I loved. But love and war are not made from the same metal. One softens, the other hardens. And over time, I felt my memories of Lysandra and Calliope fading. Not disappearing, but growing distant, like voices through a storm. I would close my eyes and see them, and then I would open them to fire and ash. I told myself I would return to them, that this was all temporary. a season of destruction for the sake of a future. But somewhere deep down, I knew I was losing the very thing I had sworn to protect, that the more I killed, the further I drifted from the man they remembered, from the man who held his daughter gently, who once smiled at his wife's quiet questions. That man was buried beneath the general, beneath the beast, and every time I looked into the mirror, all I saw were the eyes of someone I didn't recognize anymore. Night after night the fires grew higher, and night after night I found it harder to sleep. A soldier may lay his head on cold stone and drift off through exhaustion alone, but a servant of a war god cannot outrun the echoes in his own skull. When my men finally surrendered to slumber, bellies warm with stolen wine, armor piled in careless heaps, I remained awake, sharpening blades that were already keen, wiping blood from chains that could never truly be clean. Around me tents snapped in the wind like torn standards. Further off I could hear the crackle of roofs still burning in the village we had sacked at dusk. The smell of charred grain drifted on the air, mixing with the sweeter scent of pine. Sometimes an owl would call from the darkness, soft and steady, and for a heartbeat it became a lullaby from another life. Then the memory fled, chased away by a scream that wasn't there, and I was left again with the rasp of whetstone on steel and the weight of Ares's presence, thick as smoke, settling over my shoulders. I told myself these sleepless hours were vigilance. A commander must watch while others rest. Yet even as I stood guard, I felt the same question circling, quiet, insistent, as persistent as the embers drifting skyward. How much of me is left? I tried to measure the answer in familiar ways. In victories won, in lands conquered, in the number of men still willing to march behind my banner. None of it satisfied. There was a hunger inside me that triumph could not feed. I began to notice small things that should have mattered and did not. The laughter of survivors begging for mercy no longer made me hesitate. The sight of a temple spire collapsing, once a symbol of sacrilege, stirred nothing. Worse, I caught myself studying each act of destruction like a craftsman judging his own handiwork. Was the terror complete? Had the lesson been delivered? Was Ares pleased? The thought sickened me even as it settled like iron in my gut. My first instinct was no longer to shield the innocent, but to satisfy the god whose brand burned across my forearms. It was during one of these campaigns along a dry river gorge that the dreams began. At first they were fragments, smudges of color behind my eyes the moment exhaustion finally dragged me under. A small hand reaching for mine, a lullaby in a language I almost remembered, a pair of bright eyes filled not with fear, but with disappointment. I would wake drenched in sweat, fists clenched, chains rattling against the ground. Yet every dawn I pushed the images aside, burying them beneath discipline the way a soldier buries the dead beneath stone. But dreams, like seeds, grow when you least expect. Soon they flowered into visions so vivid I could taste the dust of Sparta's training yard again, could hear Deimos calling my name in panic as divine hands tore him from me. Each time I awoke, I expected to find the boy beside my cot, or my daughter breathing softly in her cradle, or Lyssandra's fingers brushing the scar at my temple. Instead, there was only darkness, the heavy stink of men, and the distant grin of torches burning in Ares's honor. By day, the war god pressed harder. He demanded speed, spectacle, cities reduced to legend before their embers cooled. He whispered of my greatness in tones that felt like chains tightening. You are more than mortal now, Kratos. You are salvation to those who follow and damnation to those who stand against you. Do not falter. And so I did not falter. I devised brutal tactics I once would have condemned. I set ambushes in holy places, knowing the shock would break enemy morale faster than steel. When my men hesitated, I reminded them of Sparta's creed, obedience above all. They obeyed, partly from fear of the god behind me, partly from faith in the legend I had become. Yet every command I gave felt as if I were cutting another thread that tethered me to the man Lysandra had loved, to the father Calliope would remember. And each severed thread drifted away on invisible currents until I feared there would be nothing left but the shell the war god had built for his purposes. One evening, after we razed a mountain village whose only crime was allegiance to a rival king, I found myself alone amid the ruins of a chapel. Statues lay shattered, tapestries smoldered in heaps. At the rear of the sanctuary I saw a crude wooden carving of a mother holding a child, still miraculously upright though scorched around the base. The faces were simple, almost childish, yet there was tenderness in the way the small hands clutched the larger. Something inside me cracked, the memory of Calliope's tiny fingers around my thumb, of Lysandra's calm gaze when the world still felt possible. For a breath I reached out, meaning to lift the carving, to spare it from the ashes. But then the weight of my chains dragged against my wrists, and Ares's voice curled through my skull like smoke. Sentiment weakens the blade. I let the carving fall. It split on the stone floor with a sound so soft it was almost a sigh, and with it another piece of me slid into silence. I walked back to camp that night beneath a sky stripped of stars, and for the first time since taking Ares's oath, I wondered whether victory was worth the cost of my own reflection. Yet dawn would come, and with dawn another order, another city, another chance to prove myself worthy of the bargain struck in trembling desperation. And so I tightened the straps on my armor, wiped the ash from my blades, and waited for the god's command, because choice, like mercy, had become a language I no longer spoke. There came a time, though I do not remember the exact season, when the sound of battle began to blend with the silence that followed it. The clang of steel, the war cries, the final breaths of fallen foes. All of it faded more quickly than before, not because I had become numb, but because I had begun to forget that there had ever been another sound. I lived now in the in-between, between one slaughter and the next, between one village reduced to ash and the promise of the next conquest. My men still followed me without question, though fewer now met my eyes. They whispered among themselves when they thought I could not hear. Some had begun to fear me. Others, worse, had begun to revere me as something no longer mortal. I made no effort to correct them. What would I say? That I still heard my daughter's voice when I closed my eyes? That I still felt the phantom warmth of a home I had not returned to in months, perhaps years? I could not admit such things. Not as Ares's champion, not as the blade of chaos. It was during the siege of a temple fortress in the north that I truly began to see the shape of the trap I had stepped into. We had been ordered to destroy it utterly. No survivors, no relics, no prayers left to echo in its ruined halls. The priests had no army, only words, old stories, and faces lined with the weight of lifetimes. They offered no resistance, only forgiveness, confused my men. It enraged Ares, and I, torn between the god who gave me power and the last crumbling pieces of myself, hesitated. I looked into the eyes of the elder who stood at the temple gates, arms wide, voice soft. "You do not have to be what he made you," he said. It was the gentlest defiance I had ever known, and it nearly stopped me, but the blades on my arms pulled forward. They had their own hunger, or perhaps the hunger was mine. I remember the sound of the first swing. I remember nothing after that. Only blood, only heat, only the knowledge as the world burned around me that Ares had not saved me. He had only weaponized my fear. That night, long after the flames had eaten the temple from within, I stood alone amid the rubble. I looked down at my hands, still trembling, the blood dried like black ink across my fingers. For the first time, I was not proud, not victorious, only empty. Ares had said I would become the perfect warrior, that I would earn glory eternal, that I would never again be powerless. But in that moment, surrounded by ash, I realized I was not free. I was bound tighter than ever. The chains on my arms were only the beginning. My thoughts no longer felt like my own. My choices were echoes. And worse, I had begun to see the shape of Ares's plan. To strip me of everything, to turn me into something so monstrous that even I would stop asking why. So that one day, when the final act came, I would carry it out without question. He did not want a servant. He wanted a destroyer, one who would tear down what even he could not touch. And I was becoming that destroyer, breath by breath. But a part of me still remembered, still resisted. That part was quiet, buried, bruised, but not yet dead. I thought of Calliope's laugh, of Lyssandra's hands weaving braids through her daughter's hair, of the way she once told me, "Strength without mercy is a shadow, and a shadow is not a man." I had scoffed at those words once, but now, standing in the wreckage of something sacred, I began to understand what she meant. I was no longer a man. I was an echo of a god's will, a vessel carved by loss and filled with fury. And I knew, in some distant part of myself, that the road ahead would only grow darker, that if I continued, I would lose even the memory of who I had been. But I did continue, because I was still his, because I still believed, foolishly, that there was a way back, that if I gave Ares enough, he might return what I had lost, that if I obeyed, I might someday find peace. But peace was never part of the deal, only war. Chapter 3: The War That Broke the Man. The war that broke me did not begin with swords. It began with silence, the kind that settles in a man's bones when he's done too much, seen too much, taken too much. I had fought in Ares's name for years by then, reduced cities to cinders, led thousands to their deaths. I had become his favorite, his trusted weapon, his storm of fire and steel. And I told myself I was close, so close, to earning what I wanted. That when it was over, I would be free. That the blood I spilled was a toll to be paid for peace. But peace does not come to men like me. Only more war. Only louder commands and quieter doubts. And so when Ares pointed toward a hidden temple, buried deep in the woods, and told me to burn it, I did not ask why. I did not ask what lay within. I only obeyed. The path there was not marked. We followed whispers. Stories passed from soldier to soldier about a forest that even the birds avoided. There were warnings, old, vague things about sacred walls, about prophecies. But I had long since stopped believing in omens. The gods gave me orders, and I followed them. That was all that mattered. When we reached the outer gates, my men hesitated. The air was thick with something heavy, not quite fear, but not far from it. I ordered them to wait. I would go in alone, a gesture of strength, of loyalty. But deep down, I think a part of me wanted to face what was inside without witnesses, as if some part of me already knew, as if some part of me, small, fragile, wanted one last chance to turn back. The temple was quiet, not abandoned, but still, like the air itself was holding its breath. The stone beneath my boots was warm, unnaturally so. The torches lit themselves as I passed, and the carvings on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. All of it should have stopped me, but I was too far gone for doubt. Ares's voice echoed in my mind like thunder in a canyon. Burn it all. Leave no trace. And I obeyed. I moved from room to room, striking down those who tried to flee, those who dared to pray. They were not warriors, but that had long stopped mattering. I was not here to fight. I was here to erase, to purify by destruction. My blades moved with grim certainty. There was no glory in it, only ash, And then I stepped into the inner chamber, and everything ended. At first, I did not recognize them. The room was thick with smoke. My heartbeat was louder than the cries. But then the shapes became clear. Two figures, one smaller, wrapped in soft cloth. The other, her hair pulled back the way I remembered. Her hands raised, not in fear, in recognition. "Kratos," she said, and that word, my name in her voice, stopped time. I did not drop my weapons. I did not fall to my knees. I stood there, blades wet, armor still glowing from fire. I stood there as a murderer, not because I meant to be, but because I had become one. I had killed them, Lysandra, Calliope, my wife, my daughter. Ares had placed them there, moved them, hidden them within the temple, not to protect them, but to test me, to prove to the gods that his warrior was more than a man, that I was his true champion, that I would destroy anything, even the last pieces of my own soul. And I did, not by choice, but by design. And when I finally saw what I had done, when their bodies lay at my feet and the fire receded, I screamed, not with rage, not with defiance, with grief so deep it felt like drowning in stone. The world spun, my knees buckled, and I begged the gods, any god, to undo what had happened. But none listened. They never do. Outside, the wind had changed. The trees leaned inward. The sky had gone gray. And there, standing at the edge of the ruins, was the oracle. Her eyes were blind, but she saw more than I ever had. "You are cursed now," she said. "Your skin will bear the truth you tried to forget. You will wear their ashes until the end of days." And before I could speak, before I could even breathe, I felt the change. My skin turned pale gray, like ash from a pyre. Their ash, their memory, forever burned into me. I became what the world would call me from then on, the ghost of Sparta. After that day, I did not return to the battlefield as a man. I returned as a shadow, something burned out and left to smolder in the ruins of what once was. My armor still fit, my blades still swung with deadly precision, and my voice still barked commands that men obeyed without hesitation. But inside, there was only ash. The faces of my wife and daughter never left me. They followed me into every fight, every village, every moment of stolen rest. I would see Calliope in the eyes of a merchant's child before the sword fell. I would hear Lysandra's voice whispering caution when I lifted my hand in rage. But I did not stop. I could not. The path I was on no longer had an end, only a direction. Forward, deeper, bloodier. It wasn't vengeance I sought yet. That would come later. What I wanted, what I craved, was distance. From what I had done. From who I had been. From the pain that refused to fade. No matter how many times I stained my blades with another man's life. Ares had gotten what he wanted. In me, he had forged the perfect servant. Not only powerful, but hollow. I no longer asked why. I no longer questioned. He no longer needed to speak commands aloud. I felt them like weights tied to my limbs, dragging me toward ever more brutal acts. Temples were burned not for strategy, but for spectacle. Innocents were slain not for necessity, but because mercy had become a word I could no longer pronounce. And yet, with each act, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt something deeper than pain, absence. Like I was no longer present in my own skin. I could hear myself speak. I could feel the blades spin in my hands. But it was as though I were watching from behind a cracked mirror, unable to stop what I had become. My men grew uneasy. They still followed, still obeyed, but some stopped speaking to me altogether. They looked at me the way one looks at a storm cloud that never moves, knowing it will bring death eventually, and praying it passes overhead instead of falling on them. The world had begun to whisper my name in fear. Not Kratos the general. Not the son of Sparta. No, they called me something else now, the ghost. It spread first in frightened tavern tales, then in hushed prayers. Beware the pale man with fire in his hands. He does not speak. He does not spare. I laughed when I first heard it, a dry sound with no joy to fit. What was I if not a ghost? A wraith of rage and grief, kept alive only by a god's favor and my own inability to die. I had tried once. After Lysandra and Calliope, I had stood at the edge of a cliff, the sea raging below. I had thought to end it, to fall, to sink, to disappear beneath the waves and be forgotten. But the moment I stepped forward, the chains glowed white-hot, and I felt Ares's hand close around my spine, unseen but undeniable. "You are mine," he whispered in the wind, "and you will not rest until I say so." I stepped back, not from fear, from futility. Even death had become a gate locked by divine hands. So I stayed. I fought. I burned. And the more I did, the more I began to understand something awful. This was never about me saving my family. It had always been about breaking me. Ares had seen what I was the moment I knelt before him in desperation. He saw a man willing to do anything to undo his weakness. And he had used that, twisted it, bent it into a weapon that no longer remembered why it was forged. I was his greatest triumph, and I hated him for it. But hate is not the same as resistance. I still obeyed. I still followed. Because what else was there? My world had become a battlefield with no enemy left to fight but the echo of my own scream. In the weeks that followed, I wandered more than I marched. I led men still, yes, but not toward strategy or victory. Toward noise. Toward fire. I was seeking something, though I would not admit it aloud. Not then. I told myself I was looking for enemies, for traitors, for rebels that defied Ares's will. But the truth was simpler and crueler. I was looking for punishment, for someone strong enough to stop me, for someone mad enough to kill the monster I had become. But none came. The world feared me too much, and those who stood against me fell too easily. Cities offered their surrender before my blades even touched their gates. The threat of me was stronger than the man I had once been. And with every surrender, every plea for mercy that I could no longer understand, the hollow inside me deepened. It was as if the world had accepted my damnation long before I had. I stopped speaking unless necessary. My voice belonged to another life now. A life where I once told my daughter bedtime stories. A life where I answered to the name Father, not Butcher. My men filled the silence with their own noise, drinking, brawling, boasting about their commander as if I could not hear. Perhaps they thought I didn't care. Perhaps they were right. But in truth, I listened to every word. I measured the distance growing between us not in steps, but in sound. Their laughter was light. Mine was gone. And slowly they began to notice. They saw that I no longer celebrated with them after victories, that I stared too long into fires, that I touched the hilts of my blades not as weapons, but as weights I could not put down. They stopped inviting me to speak, stopped asking questions, stopped meeting my gaze. I had become legend, and legends are not meant to be human. They are meant to be feared, admired from afar, spoken of in myth. I was still breathing, but no longer alive in the way they were. I was already a story being told in the past tense. It was in this state, broken, silent, loyal in form but not in spirit, that the visions returned. Not the dreams I had known before. These were different, sharper, harsher. I would see their faces in daylight now, Lysandra and Calliope, not in comfort but in judgment. Their eyes were never angry, only sad. That was worse. Anger I could have fought. Sadness I could only carry. I began to hear whispers in the corners of temples I passed through, words not spoken by mortal mouths. You were warned, they said. You chose. And worst of all, you are not finished. I did not understand what they meant. How could I not be finished? I had burned the world in Ares's name. I had buried every part of me that was human. What more could be asked of me? What else could be taken? Then came the whispers of the Furies. The threads of fate tugged at me, thin and sharp, reminding me that even the gods have their consequences. That pacts sealed in blood echo louder than oaths spoken in fear. The world had begun to shift, and though I did not yet know it, my time under Ares's command was coming to an end, not because I had found redemption, but because I had run out of pieces to give. The rage I once used as fuel was now all I had left, and rage, when left untethered, begins to look for new targets. It had started quietly, disobedience in thought, hesitation in action, a questioning glance at Ares's orders, a refusal to destroy something without reason. These were small things, but in Olympus, small cracks in loyalty grow fast, and gods do not tolerate uncertainty. One night, under a stormless sky, I stood at the edge of a ruined cliffside village. The wind was still. The sea below was silent. I looked down at my hands. They were scarred, burned, stained with history, and I asked a question I had never dared ask before. Not to Ares, not to the gods, but to myself. If I was made a monster by another's will, am I still the one who must carry its weight? There was no answer, only the waves below, dark and patient. But in that silence something stirred. Not forgiveness, not peace, but a spark, a seed of defiance. Something old, something buried. Not yet strength, but something close. And I knew, for the first time in years, that my story was not over. Not yet. Chapter 4, The Price of Oaths. There comes a moment when even the deepest rage begins to cool. Not into peace, but into clarity. After years of serving Ares, of burning the world in his name, that clarity found me like a slow dawn breaking through smoke. It did not arrive with trumpets or revelation. It came quietly, in the silence after a battle no one would remember. The city had fallen in a day. My men moved through the ruins like ghosts, looting what little had not turned to ash. And I stood at the highest point of the citadel, looking out over what I had destroyed. The sun was setting, but there was no beauty in it, just light falling over the dead. I didn't feel pride. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, not in my body, but in my soul, what was left of it. And in that weariness, I finally heard it, the quiet thought I had buried for so long. This is not what I wanted. It echoed louder with every step I took through the ruins. Once I would have called that thought weakness, a betrayal of the oath I had made. But now I saw it for what it was, the last remaining part of me that remembered why I had made that oath in the first place. I had begged Ares for power to save my family. That power had cost me everything, and in return, he had given me nothing but ruin. Not peace, not healing, just more enemies, more orders, more death. The chains around my wrists no longer burned with divine fire. They felt cold now, like shackles, and as I looked down at my hands, still stained from the day's battle, I knew they would never be clean again. Ares had not made me strong. He had made me obedient. He had made me blind. The breaking point came not with war, but with silence. I sat alone in my tent that night, my blades laid beside me, the air thick with the scent of smoke and blood. I closed my eyes and did not see my enemies. I saw Lysandra, Calliope, their faces, as clear as the day I lost them. And for the first time, I did not turn away. I let the memory come, let it stay. I let myself feel the weight of what I had done. not as a warrior, not as a servant of the gods, but as a man. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Enough to whisper a new word into the silence. No. I whispered it once, then again, each time a little louder, until finally I said it like a vow. No more. I left the tent at dawn. The air was cool. My men stirred as I passed, but I gave no orders. I walked to the edge of camp and looked up at the sky. No thunder came, no fire. Ares said nothing, and I realized then that he didn't care. Not truly. To him, I was just another sword, another tool. I had served him well, and now he had no more use for me. The rage that had driven me for so long began to change. It was no longer wild, no longer directionless. It became focused, sharp, like the tip of a spear. I would not serve him anymore, and I would not beg the other gods for mercy. What I wanted, what I needed was justice. Not the kind given from a throne, the kind forged in fire, the kind taken by hand. He had made me his monster. Now I would become his end. But walking away from a god is not a simple act. Oaths, especially those sealed in desperation, do not fade. They rot, they poison, and I could feel the venom of my past rising with every step I took. The blades of chaos remained chained to me, a cruel reminder of the power I had been given and the price I had paid. I tried to tear them from my flesh once. The wounds bled for days, but the chains would not break. Not yet. I was still bound, but not forever. Somewhere in the distance, I knew there would be a way to sever them, to unmake what Ares had done. And until that day came, I would fight not as his servant, but as his enemy. The gods do not take kindly to broken pacts. I knew this. Every Spartan child knew this. We were taught not only to fear the gods, but to respect them, to accept that their will was law, and their favor the only shield worth carrying into battle. I had once believed in that law. I had lived by it, killed by it, but now I saw it for what it truly was. A chain dressed in gold, beautiful to the faithful, but binding to those who dared to look beyond the illusion. Ares had not merely failed me. He had crafted my downfall, set it like a trap in the dark, and waited for me to step inside. He hadn't wanted a champion. He had wanted a beast, one he could unleash without consequence, without guilt. And I had served that role well, until I didn't. Until I said no. That defiance, however quiet, echoed louder than any war cry, and the gods heard it, especially him. At first, there was only silence. Ares did not confront me. He did not roar from the heavens or rain fire upon my camp. He waited. He watched. His presence lingered like smoke in my lungs, unseen, but choking. My men sensed it too. They grew restless, superstitious. They whispered of curses, of divine wrath, of omens in the sky. When a storm passed overhead and did not break, they took it as a sign. When a hawk flew too low and vanished, they saw an omen. I said nothing. What could I tell them? That the God we served was now our enemy? That I had turned from him not because I had another God to follow, but because I could no longer look at myself without wanting to drive my own blades into my chest? No, these were not words men of war understood, so I kept them to myself. My silence became armor, my thoughts a battlefield, but Ares would not remain silent for long. One night he came to me, not in flesh, but in fury. I was alone by the river, sharpening my blades out of habit more than need, when the world changed. The trees bent backward as if caught in invisible wind. The water boiled without heat, and the air grew so heavy it pressed against my skull like a hammer. Then his voice, not a whisper this time, a roar. You forget what you owe me, Kratos. I stood slowly, my hands steady, though my heart beat like war drums. I didn't speak, not at first. I let his fury wash over me like a tide, but I did not kneel. I had done that once. Never again. I gave you power, he said. I made you more than mortal. I tore the weakness from your spine and filled it with fire. And now you turn from me. His form began to take shape in the smoke. The outline of a god, massive and burning. Eyes like twin suns ready to consume all they touched. Still, I did not kneel. You killed them, I said, voice low. You used me. You made me slaughter the only reason I asked for your help. You gave me power, yes, but not to save them, to destroy them. That was your plan from the beginning. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. They were truth, but they were also an admission that I had been a fool, that I had allowed it. Ares laughed, the sound shaking the ground beneath my feet. And still you wield my gift. Still you carry my blades. You wear your chains like jewelry, and you speak of betrayal. His voice was thunder now. You were born to kill, Kratos. I simply gave your rage direction. My hands clenched, not from fear, from something older, from grief hardened into fury. No, I said, you stole my will. You poisoned my purpose. But I was never yours. I turned my back to him then, not out of bravery, but because I no longer cared what he could do to me. What more could he take? My life? My soul? Those had been gone for years. The gods screamed, and the world screamed with him. Trees split down the center. The river turned black. My skin burned not from heat, but from memory. And then, just as suddenly as he had come, Ares vanished. Not defeated, not finished, but shaken, because even gods fear the mortal who has nothing left to lose. After the confrontation by the river, the world did not change, but I did. Something in me, something deep, long buried, finally shifted. I had always carried my rage like a shield, something to keep me upright, something that gave weight to every step I took. But now it became a different thing entirely. It was no longer a tool. It was no longer fire. It was steel, cold, heavy, sharpened not by chaos, but by purpose. I would not be Ares' servant anymore, and I would not let another god take his place. The gods had shown me what their power truly was, cruelty disguised as providence. They watched from their thrones while mortals bled in their names. They toyed with lives like pieces on a board. And I, Kratos, had once believed they could be bargained with, that they might show mercy, that they might care. I was wrong. The gods were not above men. They were beneath them, because at least a man could learn. A man could change. A god, once betrayed, only punished. I began to move differently after that. Not aimlessly, but without orders. For the first time in years, I chose where to walk, what to fight, what to leave standing. My men, confused at first, followed with caution. They saw the change. They heard it in my silence, heavier than before. They felt it when I spared a village that had once allied with our enemies. Not because I pitied them, but because I no longer found glory in destruction. Some questioned me, quietly, respectfully. One dared to speak his doubts aloud by the fire. "What are we now, Commander, if not warriors?" he asked. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "Free." It was not an answer they expected. Some did not accept it. They drifted away over time, seeking new banners to serve. Others stayed, drawn not to my leadership, but to something older, hope, perhaps, or defiance. The first few nights, I slept without dreams. Then, slowly, the dreams returned. But this time, they did not bring only pain. They brought questions. What does a man do when the gods no longer own him? What does a warrior become when he sets down his purpose? These questions followed me like shadows, and I had no answers. I wandered from province to province, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost of my own making. I helped where I could, fought only when forced. There were those who remembered my name and tried to kill me for what I had done. I let them try. Some succeeded in drawing blood. None succeeded in ending me. And with each battle I felt the chains grow heavier, not in weight but in meaning. They were no longer Ares's mark. They were my own. A reminder that forgiveness is not given. It is earned. And I had a long road to walk before I could even ask for it. It was in one ruined town, abandoned, half swallowed by the forest, that I first said it aloud. I stood alone beneath a crumbling archway, the sky gray with rain, and I whispered, "I will kill him," not as a threat, not as a cry for vengeance, as a promise. Ares had made me into what I was, but he had not broken me, not fully. I still stood, I still breathed, and I had learned that gods could be wounded, that they feared defiance. I did not yet know how I would do it, what weapon would be enough, what ally might help. But I knew this. I would not stop until it was done, until the God who destroyed my family, who made me kill with my own hands, was nothing but dust. I would tear Olympus down, stone by stone if I had to, and bury Ares beneath its weight. That vow gave me something I had not felt in years: direction. Not command, not compulsion, choice, and with it came a strange kind of calm. The calm of a man who knows what must be done. The calm before a final war. I would no longer wait for the gods to send their fury. I would bring it to them. I would climb to the heights they thought untouchable, and I would remind them that even immortals can bleed. The chains burned, yes. The past still followed me, yes. But I walked forward now with open eyes, with a purpose not given but chosen. And in that choice, I began to become something else. Not a general, not a monster, not even a father, just a man with a mission, and nothing left to lose. Chapter 5: A God Can Bleed. The idea that a god could bleed was not born in Olympus. It was born in me, in the quiet moments between the battles, after I had renounced Ares but before I understood what that truly meant. Mortals worship the divine because they believe the gods are untouchable, immortal in body, flawless in will. But I had seen the gods, heard their voices, felt their hands twist my fate. They were not flawless. They were cruel, petty, vain, and above all afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of defiance, afraid of men like me, men who had nothing left to lose and no more reason to kneel. I did not yet know how to strike them down, but I knew this. Anything that fears can be hurt, and anything that can be hurt can be killed. My journey began not with a sword, but with questions. Who had stood against the gods before? Who had dared to name them false, to challenge their will? The answers were buried, hidden in half-burned texts, whispered in corners of forgotten temples, etched into stone too old for memory. I became a seeker, not of wisdom but of weapons. My path led me to the Oracle of Athens, a woman blind not by fate, but by choice. She had gouged out her own eyes, claiming it was the only way to see truth unclouded by illusion. She did not scream when she saw me. She did not beg. She only said, "He fears you now." I asked her what that meant. She said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "If you would kill a god, you must find that which even the divine cannot control. You must seek the power beneath the mountain. You must walk the path of titans." I left that day with a name on my tongue I had not spoken in years. Kratos, the father of the gods, the one cast down by Zeus, the one bound in chains deeper than the earth. If the titans still lived, and I was not sure they did, then perhaps they, too, hungered for vengeance. I began to travel north, where the land turned to stone and snow, where the sky hung lower and the wind howled with the voices of things older than Olympus. There were trials, yes, monsters, guardians, curses laid to stop those who would trespass. But I moved through them like water moves through cracks. Not unstoppable, but inevitable. I no longer fought with fury. I fought with certainty. Along the way, I began to speak again, not to others, but to myself. I told my story in fragments, sometimes aloud, as if by naming the truth I could weaken it. I killed them. I would whisper to the night. I served him. I let him make me a beast. These confessions did not ease the weight I carried, but they gave it shape. They reminded me that I was not a god. I was a man, a broken one, but a man still, and a man can choose his path, even if it leads to ruin. The blades of chaos still clung to me like a curse, but I had begun to see them differently, not as tools of destruction, but as proof of my past, proof of what I had survived, and perhaps someday proof of what I would overcome. The deeper into the north I traveled, the stranger the world became. I saw statues older than Greece, carved in the image of beings I did not know. I crossed bridges made of bones, walked through forests where time itself seemed twisted. I dreamed more vividly now, of titans, of fire, of golden chains snapping in the dark. Whether these visions were sent by the gods or by something else, I did not know. But they guided me, they pulled me forward, until at last, I came to the mouth of a great canyon, black as a wound. And there, written in blood on the stone, were the words, "Only those who bleed may enter." I did not hesitate. I pressed my palm to the blade, drew my own blood, and stepped into the dark. If the gods had not feared me before, they would now. The canyon's darkness was not simply an absence of light. It was something heavier, something alive. I felt it wrap around me the moment I crossed the threshold, not with claws or violence, but with memory. Whispers followed me, though no voices spoke. I saw shadows that moved without source, flickering across jagged stone like forgotten sins. My own sins. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the ground itself recognized what I carried. Rage, guilt, loss, and judged it unworthy. Yet still I pressed on. For the first time, I did not seek a battlefield. I sought answers. Power, yes, but not for its own sake. I needed something strong enough to break a god, not match him, end him. And the answers, I believed, lived somewhere in this deep, ancient place. The deeper I went, the more the walls around me changed. The stone gave way to something older, bone, maybe, or petrified flesh. I could not be sure. Symbols etched in an unknown tongue lined the tunnel ceilings. Some burned when I passed. Others bled. I kept my eyes forward. I did not ask what they meant. Some knowledge does not grant strength, it grants madness. And I had already tasted enough of that to know its bitterness. But something inside me stirred with every step, something deeper than fear or anger. A recognition. I was not the first to walk this path. Others had come before. Warriors, betrayers, fallen champions. Some had been consumed, others transformed. Their echoes lingered in the walls. Pain without bodies, fury without names. And yet none had returned. Perhaps they had found what I now sought, or perhaps they had become it. At the canyon's heart, I found it. Not a god, not a monster. A door, enormous, jagged, cracked down the middle like an old wound. Pulsed faintly, like something inside still breathed. Across its surface were chained figures, carvings of titans, twisted in agony, eyes wide with betrayal. Kratos was among them. I recognized his face from the stories, but in this rendering he was not majestic. He was afraid. Beneath the carvings were 3 words, scorched into the stone in a tongue I did not speak, but understood. Blood opens memory. I stood there for a long time, unsure what to offer. Then I remembered the oracle's words. Only what the gods fear can undo them, and what they fear most is what they cannot control. So I did what they never expected. I cut deep, not into my palm, but into my forearm, where the chains of Ares had long ago burned their mark into my flesh. The blades of chaos groaned as if in protest. But I did not stop. I pressed the wound against the door, and for a moment, nothing. Then the stone shuddered. The carvings screamed. The door split open, and heat poured from the darkness beyond. Not the warmth of fire, but of old hatred still burning. I stepped through. What I saw on the other side was not a chamber. It was a memory, mine but twisted. The temple where I had killed Lysandra and Calliope stood before me, but broken, silent, frozen in a single moment, the second before my blade struck. I reached for them instinctively, but they were not there. I stood empty-handed, forced to watch, to feel, over and over. Ares's laughter echoed above, distant but constant. This was not illusion. It was punishment. The price of seeking power meant to unmake the divine was to face the full weight of what had made me seek it in the first place. I dropped to my knees, not in surrender but in understanding. This was the truth of vengeance. It does not give. It only takes, even when you win. But I did not leave. I did not cry out. I sat in the ruins of my memory and let it burn around me. I let the pain crawl back in. And when it passed, when the memory faded into ash and the chamber grew quiet, something remained. Not clarity, not forgiveness, but a spark, a voice, not from the gods, from within. Now, it said, you're ready. When I emerged from the canyon, the sky had changed. The clouds hung lower. The light was dimmer, but not with the weight of storm, something else. A stillness, the kind that arrives after a long fire burns itself out. My body bore new scars, my mind new cracks, but I was not broken. Not this time. I was changed, hardened not by blind rage, but by the truth I had finally faced. That my vengeance, if it was to mean anything, had to be more than violence. It had to be a reckoning, not just for Ares, for all of Olympus. I had glimpsed the source of their power, their fear, and it was not invulnerability. It was pride. It was the belief that no one would ever rise high enough to reach them, that no mortal could ever hold them accountable. I had no crown, no divine favor, but I had something purer, will. Word of my survival spread fast. Even in silence, the world listens when something impossible happens. They called me mad, cursed, marked. I did not deny it. The blades of chaos still burned in my grip, but they no longer guided me. They obeyed. I had bent them not with strength, but with resolve, with pain endured. And in doing so, I had bent a piece of Ares's own magic to my will. That was my first lesson. The gods are not as untouchable as they pretend. Their weapons can be turned. Their will resisted. It was only a matter of time before Ares learned I had not died in the canyon, that I had walked through his trial and come out alive. But I did not run. I waited. I prepared. I returned to Sparta for the first time in years. Not in triumph, not to reclaim glory, but because I needed to remember who I was before the chains, before the war, before the gods. The city had changed. My name was still spoken in whispers, etched into stone and story. Some cheered when I arrived. Others turned away, unwilling to face the man who had become legend through horror. I did not blame them. I walked the streets alone. I visited the temple where I had once prayed for Calliope's life. The altar was gone. replaced by a statue of a warrior draped in ash, blades chained to his wrists. I looked into its eyes and saw not reverence, but warning. I did not stay long. There were those who still remembered me, a few old soldiers, a boy who claimed his father had marched under my command. He brought me food without asking questions. In that quiet I trained, not my body, my will. I honed it like a blade, let go of the chaos I had once used as fuel, focused instead on what must come next. I would not be strong enough to face Ares as I was. Not yet. I needed allies, relics, secrets the gods had buried and forgotten. And most of all, I needed to remember that I was mortal, because that was what made me dangerous. Gods cannot change, but men can, and in that I held the one power Olympus feared most. I left Sparta in silence. No farewells, no promises, just a final glance at the hills beyond the city, the same ones I had once climbed as a child. I walked not as a soldier, nor as a servant, but as something new, not yet born, but awakening. Every step I took from that moment forward was no longer for survival. It was a path drawn toward one single truth. A god can bleed, and I would be the one to make it happen. Chapter 6, Wrath of the Forgotten. There are names that even the gods whisper in fear, not out of reverence, but out of memory. Because before Olympus stood tall and golden in the clouds, before Zeus wielded thunder and Poseidon commanded the sea, there were others older, larger, crueler in their rawness. The Titans, born of sky and stone, of chaos and time. The gods defeated them long ago in a war that cracked the world's bones and split the heavens. But they did not destroy them. They imprisoned them, buried them deep in the folds of the earth, in forgotten places where light does not reach and memory turns to pain. That was their mistake. You do not bury rage and expect it to die. You only give it time to grow teeth. I knew this, and I knew that if I was to challenge a god, I would need more than a blade. I would need the fury of those who once made the gods bleed. The path to the Titans was not marked on any map. It was drawn in myth, carved into stone by trembling hands, guarded not by creatures but by belief itself. Most mortals had long since stopped speaking their names. To do so invited madness, or worse, hope. But I followed their stories like a trail of embers across the world. I hunted ruins, temples lost beneath sands and swallowed by mountains. I read words scratched into broken columns, warnings, curses, cries for justice. And through it all, a single name appeared again and again. Gaia, the mother, the earth itself, not a titan of fire or wind or war, but of life and time and memory. If any of them still watched the world from beneath it, it would be her. My journey took me to the edge of the world, beyond Sparta, beyond the borders of any kingdom. I walked alone into lands where even the stars felt unfamiliar. The ground changed. It pulsed faintly underfoot, like something ancient was still breathing beneath the soil. I followed that pulse, deeper into the mountains, until I found the cave. It was not carved by men. The rock twisted unnaturally, spiraling like a throat down into the heart of the world. There were markings at the entrance, symbols not written but grown like veins. I touched one, felt warm, alive. I did not hesitate. I stepped inside. Inside, the world fell away. There was no light, no floor, no sense of direction, only descent. I was not falling, and yet I moved downward. Time stretched, my memories blurred. I saw visions, flashes of my past, but twisted. My daughter's laughter, caught in an endless echo. My wife's hand reaching for mine, always just out of reach. The voice of Ares, not as a god, but as a whispering storm. You are mine, Kratos. I clenched my fists and pressed forward. Whatever this place was, it wanted to break me, but I had already been broken. This was not the first time I walked through hell. It would not be the last. Finally, I found ground beneath my feet again. The air was thick and damp, the silence so complete it rang in my ears. In the darkness, a shape moved, enormous, slow, ancient. It was not a beast. It was not a god. It was something between. A massive form curled around itself, half-rooted in the stone, breathing so deeply it shook the walls. Eyes opened in the dark, green, vast, filled with sorrow older than war. And then the voice came, not aloud. It echoed inside my chest. You seek vengeance. I nodded. You seek death for a god. Another nod. Then you must know what it means to become more than man. I did not answer. I didn't need to. Gaia already knew. She saw the scars, the chains, the fire behind my eyes. And still, she asked, will you carry their fury? Will you be the hand that strikes the sky? I stepped forward, not in defiance, but in understanding. I will. The cave trembled. The roots pulsed. Gaia's breath warmed the stone. Then remember, ghost of Sparta, vengeance is not justice, but justice may yet be forged from wrath. With those words, I felt something shift within me. A seed planted, a bond made, not one of chains, but of choice. I had found the wrath of the forgotten. Now I would carry it to Olympus. When I emerged from the cave, the world did not look different, but I knew something had changed. The air felt heavier, as if it too bore the memory of what had passed within that mountain. The bond one had made was not sealed in blood, nor branded by fire. It was older than either. It was a pact between fury and purpose, born not of desperation, but of shared betrayal. Gaia had not promised me power as Ares once had. She had offered only one thing, truth. The truth that the gods could be challenged, that their reign was not eternal, that their sins had not been forgotten, and I would be the one to remind them. I had not come seeking to become a titan, but in carrying their wrath, I had become something else, an echo of what they were, a reflection of what the gods feared most, a mortal who knew their secrets. I traveled with new direction, no longer searching blindly, but guided by purpose. Gaia's voice lingered in my mind, not as command, but as presence. Her memories whispered to me through the earth beneath my feet. I could feel the tremors of long-buried things, battles fought beneath the surface, the thunder of chains breaking, the slow heartbeats of giants who had once held the sky on their shoulders. I sought them out, not the titans themselves, but the remnants of their strength. Artifacts, weapons, symbols of the war the gods wanted erased. In the sunken remains of a temple half swallowed by the sea, I found the broken horn of Oceanus, still humming with ancient resonance. In a forgotten desert ruin, I uncovered the ashes of Hyperion, still warm to the touch. Each relic I claimed was not just a tool, it was a piece of memory, a piece of proof that the gods could bleed because they had bled before. But the gods were watching. I felt their gaze in the sky, in the sudden storms that followed my path, in the unnatural silence that fell when I entered a town. They did not strike yet. Perhaps they did not believe. Perhaps they still thought me broken. But they knew something stirred, and Olympus does not tolerate echoes from the past. I began to encounter resistance, not from mortals, but from servants of the divine. Beasts not born of nature, but shaped by divine fear. Stone sentries with eyes that glowed like starlight, serpents whose fangs dripped poison older than time. They did not speak. They did not threaten. They came only to destroy. I met them not with fury, but with certainty. My blades no longer trembled. My strikes carried not only strength, but history. Each enemy I felled was another voice silenced by Olympus, another shadow trying to keep the truth buried. I gave them rest. I gave them purpose. And then I moved on. There was a moment, high in the mountains near Delphi, where I stopped. The wind there was cold and clear. The sky stretched wide above me. I could see for miles valleys, rivers, cities reduced to dust. I stood at the edge of a cliff, alone, and I let the silence surround me. For a breath, I let myself wonder, was I truly the one to do this? Could a man scarred by so much, haunted by blood, burdened by guilt, truly be the one to bring wrath to gods? But then I remembered the cave, Gaia's eyes, the door marked in blood, the weight of the chains I still wore. I was not the one they had chosen. I was the one they had created. Ares, Zeus, Olympus, they made me, they shaped my rage, and now they would face it. Below the mountain lay a valley thick with mist. Within that mist, Gaia had whispered, rested something old. A place where the Titans had once gathered before war, where they had bled into the earth and left their hatred behind like seeds. She called it the womb of time. There I would find what I needed. Not another weapon, not a spell, but a memory, a truth strong enough to shatter illusion, strong enough to crack Olympus itself. I turned from the peak and began my descent. The wrath of the forgotten was not just mine to carry now. It was mine to unleash. The valley known as the womb of time did not welcome me. It swallowed me. Mist curled like fingers around my ankles. The air was thick, not with fog, but with memory, with presence. The ground pulsed faintly with a rhythm older than heartbeats. It felt like walking through the chest of something vast and sleeping. Every step forward stirred visions, not illusions, not dreams, but living recollections. I saw giants fall beneath the spears of young gods. I saw fire rain from the sky, not from the heavens, but from mouths of titans screaming in agony. I heard chains being forged from the screams of the defeated. And through it all, I felt a hum, a deep, unrelenting vibration in my bones. It was not sound. It was fury, not mine but theirs, still alive, still waiting, still hating. At the center of the valley stood a stone spire, cracked and hollow. The earth around it was scorched, though no fire burned. This was the place Gaia had whispered of, the place where the Titans had once gathered before the Great War, not to strategize, to bleed, to bind themselves together with pain and purpose. I walked slowly to its base. The walls were covered in carvings, not of battles, but of betrayal. Zeus casting Kratos into chains, Hades feeding fallen titans to his beasts, Poseidon flooding sanctuaries built to honor the old ones. And at the center, untouched by time or decay, a single mark, a handprint, massive, twisted, burned into the stone. I knew what it asked. I placed my palm beside it. My mortal flesh barely filled half its space. And yet the stone responded. It trembled, cracked, opened. Inside the spire was not a chamber, but a memory given form. The very air shimmered with old power. At its heart stood a figure, not man, not titan, a silhouette of fire and ash. It did not speak. It did not move, but it showed me what the gods had hidden. The day the titans fell, one among them refused to be chained. He turned his body to flame, his voice to storm, and his name to silence. He became the wrath they buried, the force they could not kill. And now that force stirred. It recognized me, not as ally, not as heir, as vessel. For the first time, I did not feel alone in my rage. I felt surrounded, carried, not comforted but known. The figure vanished, but its heat remained. My skin did not burn, but it ached, as if something inside had been set alight. I dropped to one knee, not in reverence, but in sheer weight. The chains on my arms pulsed. The blades of chaos flickered with an ember I had never seen before. Then I heard it. Not with ears, but inside my mind. We are not gods. We are not men. We are what they made, and what will unmake them. The voice was many, male, female, old, new. It was every titan who had fallen, every one who had been forgotten. I did not ask for their power. I accepted their anger, not as a gift, but as a burden, one I had already earned. When I rose, the mist cleared. The sky above had darkened, though no night had fallen. The valley was still. The womb of time was no longer a memory. It had become a weapon, not to be wielded, but to be carried. The wrath of the Titans now lived inside me, not as magic, not as strength, as purpose. And that purpose was clear. I would not march to Olympus to beg for justice. I would not kneel and demand mercy. I would tear down their throne, stone by stone, and bury their sins in the same earth they tried to forget. I would become the storm they created, the echo they feared. The reckoning they denied would ever come. I left the valley in silence. Not a single word passed my lips. What needed to be said had already been written into stone, into blood, into the very ground I walked. The gods had forgotten the Titans. They had buried them deep and told the world to worship something new. But I remembered, carried them now, and soon so would Olympus, not in reverence, but in ruin. Chapter 7: The Fall of the War God. The day I faced Ares did not come with thunder. There were no horns, no fire in the sky, no armies trembling the earth beneath their march. Came with stillness, the kind that arrives when something inevitable has awakened. I stood at the edge of Athens, a city already broken by war, its temples cracked and leaning, its streets scattered with ash. The people had long since fled or perished, and the gods watched in silence from behind their clouds. Ares had made this place a monument to himself, a shrine of ruin and blood, and I had followed him here, not to beg for justice, not to ask for peace. I came to end him, not as his warrior, not as his weapon, but as the very result of his own making. I was what he created, and now I was here to return the gift. He stood tall in the ruins of a temple once devoted to Athena, his laughter rising like flame into the darkened sky. Clad in armor wrought from nightmares, with a blade forged of divine hatred, he turned to me like a father greeting a disobedient child. "You've returned," he said, voice heavy with amusement. "I thought the Titans might have swallowed you whole. Or perhaps your grief did." I said nothing. Words were no longer the weapon I needed. He gestured to the fallen city, arms wide. "Do you see it, Kratos? Do you see what war can truly be when guided by vision?" Again, I remained still. He stepped closer, eyes burning with the confidence of a god who has never known loss. "I gave you power. You were nothing before me, a mortal drenched in rage and ambition. I made you what you are. That was when I spoke. Quietly, calmly. You made a mistake." His smile faltered for a heartbeat, just long enough for the silence to stretch between us. "You gave me strength," I said, "but you thought it would always serve you, that it would chain me. But strength is not loyalty, and pain is not obedience." The chains around my forearms pulsed. The blades of chaos, now burning with the fury of Titans, flared. He recognized it instantly, not just the power, but the purpose behind it. And for the first time I saw it, not fear, but understanding. He knew what was coming. He knew I had come not as the man who once knelt at his feet, but as the judgment he thought would never arrive. Ares did not wait for me to strike. He was not the sort of god to yield the first move. His rage was constant, as natural as breath, and now it erupted like wildfire. The earth beneath our feet cracked as his blade met the ground, sending a wave of divine fury outward, splitting the stone temple apart. He charged with the force of 100 battles behind him, every step shaking the world. But I did not move. Not yet. I had seen this fire before, raw, untamed, meant to intimidate, to overwhelm. It had once ruled me, once burned through my soul and turned my grief into servitude. But now I stood calm, not because I underestimated his power, but because I understood it. Chaos had once been my leash. Now it was my weapon. When his blade came down, I moved, not faster than him, not stronger, but with clarity. My blades met his, not to match strength, but to redirect it. I turned his fury into angles, his wildness into missteps. Every strike was louder than thunder. Every clash sent ripples through the air. Buildings collapsed around us, statues shattered. The gods, high above, watched in silence. They had always seen Ares as their hammer, the god of war, breaker of rebellions, destroyer of men. But now they saw something else. They saw a man who had once knelt in blood, who had once begged for help, now standing with the fury of titans behind him and the memory of all he'd lost carved into his flesh. I fought not for glory, not for power. I fought because I must, because no god should be allowed to create monsters and expect them to stay leashed. Ares roared, his voice shaking the very air. "You are nothing without me," he bellowed, slamming his massive fist into the earth. Pillars fell. Flames burst from cracks in the stone. "I gave you purpose. I gave you a legacy." I ducked beneath his strike, rolled through ash and blood, and rose behind him. "You gave me chains," I answered, "and now I return them." I flung the blades of chaos forward, not at his body, but at his memory, at everything he stood for. I drove them deep into his armor, not to kill him with steel, but with choice. I would show him that the pain he forged in me had become the thing that would unmake him. The Titan's fire surged through the blades, and for a moment, just a breath, I saw it. Doubt. The war god blinked. But Ares would not fall easily. He rose, towering, growing in size, his form swelling with divine power. Wings of fire burst from his back, and his voice became a hurricane. He summoned visions, illusions of my family, begging, burning, reaching. He tried to twist my mind as he once had, to drag me back into guilt. But I did not flinch. I did not close my eyes. "You don't control me anymore," I said, walking through the flames. "I remember their screams. I remember what you made me do, and I will carry it with me, but I will not kneel to it." Ares screamed, the illusion shattering like glass, and now the air between us grew still. For the first time, he knew. This was not a warrior. This was judgment. The final moments of battle came not with chaos, but with silence. Ares stood across from me, blood streaking down his divine form, not red like a mortal's, but black as obsidian. His armor had cracked, his fury had dimmed, and now, as the flames around us began to die, he looked at me, not as a god above a man, but as a creator watching his creation turn against him. He spoke, voice rough with disbelief. "Even now, after all I gave you, you would strike me down?" I said nothing. What words remained that had not already been burned into the ruins at our feet? He had made me a monster, and monsters do not weep. They end what must be ended. Slowly I raised the blades of chaos, once his gift, now his sentence. He made one last charge. There was no power behind it, only pride. A desperate swing, fueled by the weight of centuries spent ruling through violence. But I met it not with defense, not with counterstrike. I stepped inside the blow, into his reach, and plunged the blades through his chest with the full weight of my wrath. The fire of the Titans surged through them, igniting divine flesh. Ares staggered, choking on disbelief. His hands reached for the wound, as though even he could not understand the pain. The sky above us opened, not in celebration, but in warning. Thunder cracked, light split the clouds, but Olympus did not intervene. Not now, not after what they had seen. The gods watched as one of their own fell, not to another god, but to a mortal who had refused to stay broken. Ares dropped to his knees. The war god, the breaker of nations, the one who had once whispered into the ears of kings and turned them into butchers, now bowed before the man he had forged. He tried to speak, but only blood came, and then, slowly, he collapsed into the dirt. His final breath was not a roar. It was a sigh, quiet thing, as if, in the last instant, he had understood that this end was always coming. That you do not build monsters and expect them to die peacefully. That pain, once unleashed, will always come home. I stood over him, not triumphant, not vindicated, simply finished. The flames around us faded. The dust began to settle. The ruins of Athens stood quiet once more, broken not by armies, but by the end of an era. I felt the weight of the blades still pulsing in my hands, hotter than ever. Not from magic, from memory. They had ended the god who gave them life, and now they hungered for more. But I was not yet ready to listen. I looked to the sky, to the thrones far above, and I spoke, not with hate, but with promise. This is only the beginning. I turned from Ares's body and walked into the smoke. Behind me, the air shimmered, the veil between realms thin. For a moment, I felt something stir, a watching presence. Not Zeus, not Athena, something older, something silent. I knew that killing a god would not go unanswered, that Olympus would not let this stand. But I had no fear. I had killed a god. I had broken a chain that no mortal was ever meant to lift. And now the gods would remember what they tried to forget, that their thrones rest on the bones of men. And some men remember, some men return, some men rise. Chapter 8: The Ghost and the Throne. Victory is never as loud as the battle that precedes it. There were no cheers when Ares fell, no songs carved into marble, no heralds to declare the war god slain by mortal hand. When I left his broken body in the ruins of Athens, the city did not rise in celebration. It remained quiet, hushed, as if the very stones beneath our feet had watched what took place and chose to mourn instead of rejoice. I walked away not as a hero, not as a savior, but as something harder to define. A man who had taken vengeance into his own hands and found, at the end of it, not peace but silence. The kind of silence that clings to the soul, heavy, cold, waiting for the next weight to fall. Athena came to me soon after, not in glory or divine brilliance, but quietly, through shadow and wind. Her form appeared between flickers of torchlight, eyes full of something I could not yet name. "You have done what none dared to do," she said. "You have slain a god." Her voice held neither joy nor judgment, only a weight of knowledge I didn't understand then. I asked her why the others had let it happen, why Olympus watched and did nothing. Her answer was simple: because we needed it to happen. I should have known. The gods rarely act out of mercy. Even their silence is strategy. Ares had become a threat, not just to mortals but to Olympus itself. His war had grown too wild, too hungry, and in me they saw the tool that could cut away the infection. They saw a solution. They did not see the man. She offered me something then, not reward, not rest, a throne. "The seat of the god of war is empty," she said. "It must not remain so. I looked at her, half in disbelief, half in anger. I had killed Ares to free myself, not to replace him. I had bled for years under his name, burned villages, slaughtered innocents, lost my wife and child. I had worn the chains of war tighter than any man before me, and now they offered me his crown? Athena placed a hand upon my shoulder, her voice soft. You are not him, Kratos, but the world will always need a god of war. Better one who remembers pain. I turned away, said nothing, but the words stayed with me, clinging like ash. Better one who remembers pain. I tried to walk away. I wandered far from the ruins of Athens, into hills and forests where no cities stood. I built no fire, slept little, ate less. I watched the stars in silence and wondered if they, too, looked down on what I had done with fear, or if they, like the gods, had grown used to watching blood spill below. Days passed, or weeks. Time became fog. I hunted wild animals not for survival, but for noise, something to drown the silence inside. But no matter how far I walked, I could not leave what I had done. The chains remained. The blades of chaos, still bound to my arms, glowed faintly in the dark. I could not remove them. I did not try. They had become part of me, reminders, punishments, warnings. Ares was gone, but what he made of me still lived. One night, I stood at the edge of a cliff, high above a quiet sea. The moon shone silver across the water, and I imagined what it might feel like to fall. Not to die, but to disappear, to let the waves swallow the ghost that walked in my skin. I thought of Lysandra, of Calliope, of the life that had once been mine, and I wondered, not for the first time, if they would recognize the man I had become, if they would forgive him, if I could ever forgive him. The wind whispered, soft and low, and in it I heard Athena's voice again. The world needs a god of war, one who remembers. I closed my eyes, not in peace, but in surrender. Maybe that was the truth of vengeance. It does not free you. It only replaces the chains. When I returned to Olympus, the gates opened not with celebration, but with silence. No trumpets, no divine light bathing my arrival. The gods stood distant, watching, some with curiosity, others with disdain. They whispered among themselves about me, about what I had done. None dared speak it aloud, but I saw it in their faces. I was not one of them. I never would be. I was a weapon they had used, a wound they had accepted in order to cut away another. And now I was something inconvenient, dangerous, a mortal who had walked their halls and left footprints they could not erase. But Athena met me at the steps of the great throne room, her face calm, her eyes steady. It is time, she said. I gave no reply, only a nod. The chamber where the thrones of Olympus stood was carved from marble and pride, each seat crafted in the image of its god. Zeus's high and storm-wreathed, Poseidon's rippling with the illusion of waves, Apollo's radiant with golden flame. But Ares's seat sat in the shadow of them all, forged of blackened iron and scorched stone. It rose like a blade among shields. It was empty, waiting. I walked toward it slowly. Every step echoed louder than the last. I could feel their eyes on me, the gods, the fates, the ghosts of my past. And as I climbed the stairs, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel elevation. I felt weight, heavy, immovable. This was not a reward. It was a verdict. They were not giving me power. They were binding me to it. I stood before the throne and looked down at the blades still chained to my arms. The same ones Ares had given me. The same ones I had used to destroy him. Fire still flickered faintly along their edge, as if the fury of the Titans had not yet settled. I thought of removing them, of casting them aside. But I knew better. Even if the chains broke, the memory would remain. The screams, the flames, the blood, they would follow me here, into the clouds, onto the throne. I turned, faced the hall, and slowly sat. The throne groaned beneath me. The chamber trembled. The gods said nothing. Athena stepped forward, lifted her hand, and declared what no one else would. Let the world know. The god of war now wears a mortal's face. The words echoed far beyond Olympus, down into the mortal realms, across cities still smoldering from Ares's madness, across temples, across whispers. The name Kratos was no longer just a scarred Spartan, no longer a tale told in taverns. It became something else, a warning, promise, a question. Can a mortal carry the mantle of a god without becoming the very thing he fought to destroy? I did not know the answer. I still don't. But I sat on that throne with fire in my blood and ghosts in my shadow. Not to command war, but to watch it, to hold it back, to keep it from consuming others as it had consumed me. But even then, in that moment of divine recognition, I felt it deep in my chest, in the marrow of my bones. The throne did not silence the voices. It did not lift the weight. It only changed the room in which I carried it. The blades of chaos remained. The memories remained. And in the back of my mind, a whisper began. Not Athena, not the Titans. Something deeper, something older, said nothing clear. Only this is not the end. Time passed, though in Olympus it did not move as it does in the world below. Days did not end. Seasons did not shift. There was only light or shadow, silence or storm. I sat on the throne of war, high above the lands I once fought to protect, and watched them from afar. I saw kings rise and fall. I saw villages rebuilt from ashes I had left behind. I saw men and women live, love, and die, all without ever knowing the name of the god who now held dominion over their wars. I did not interfere. I did not speak. I was not a god in the image of those who had come before. I did not hunger for offerings or build temples in my name. I simply watched, and the longer I watched, the more I understood why the gods grew so distant, so cruel. It is easy to lose your soul when you no longer walk among those who suffered. I tried, in the early days, to change things, to stop battles before they began. I whispered warnings to generals in their sleep. I broke swords before they could be drawn. I sent dreams of peace to kings drunk with ambition. And for a while it worked. Borders held. Treaties remained signed. The earth breathed a little easier. But mortals are not so different from gods. They forget kindness. They ignore mercy. And eventually they return to war. Not because I had failed, but because peace is a burden many cannot bear. And so I learned. My power did not lie in preventing war. It lay in witnessing it, shaping it, guiding its hand when it became inevitable. I did not like the lesson, but I accepted it. I had already learned that choice was often an illusion, and sometimes the only power left is in how one carries what cannot be changed. Even in Olympus, the past remained. The dreams returned, no longer visions of Ares, but echoes of the temple I had once destroyed. I saw Lysandra, her eyes full of sorrow. I saw Calliope, reaching for me with hands too small to hold a blade. And I saw myself, not as god, not as warrior, but as a man kneeling in the blood of his own making. I tried to shut them out. I buried myself in silence, in stillness. But guilt is louder than thunder. And in that throne room, it echoed off marble and gold more sharply than any battlefield. The gods above would not speak of it. The mortals below would not know it. But I carried it, every moment, every breath. Athena visited often. She brought word from the world below, advice from the gods above. She always looked at me with something between admiration and pity, as if I were a statue carved of both iron and ash, impressive but fragile beneath the surface. "You do well," she said one day, placing her hand gently on my shoulder. "You've brought stability to a title once ruled by madness." I said nothing. Praise meant little when it came from mouths that had once been silent during my suffering. "There is still hope for you," she added. "Even here." I turned to her slowly. "Hope is not what I carry," I said. "Only memory." She left without another word. And so I remained, the ghost of Sparta, now seated in the heavens, surrounded by power he never asked for and burdened by the very thing he thought victory would erase. The gods called me brother now. They nodded in passing. But I knew the truth. They did not see me as one of them. I was a scar, a reminder of what even the divine could not control. A mortal who had risen too far, and they feared what might come if I ever rose again. I looked out across the horizon, where clouds gathered without thunder, a stillness that did not promise peace but change. I felt something stir beneath the surface, not from Olympus, from the world below, something waking, something that remembered me, and I whispered, not as a god, but as a man who had lost everything and gained nothing. "It is not over." Chapter 9, Before the Storm. Time passed, though I could no longer measure it by sun or season. In Olympus, the world hung in a permanent state of golden twilight, as though even the heavens had grown weary of shifting between light and dark. I sat upon the throne of war, high above the world of mortals, and watched their lives unfold like distant ripples on a lake. I saw skirmishes in far-off deserts, border disputes that never seemed to end, and the quiet, endless drums of conflict that beat beneath every crown. I did not move to stop them, not anymore. I had learned that mortals would always find reasons to bleed. My task now was to watch, to listen, and to intervene only when the gods themselves tipped the balance too far. But even then I felt it, a weight in the air, a tightness beneath the surface of every still moment. The silence was not peace, it was pressure, and something beneath it was beginning to crack. First it was dreams, not the tortured visions I had long grown used to, of blood and ash and the echoing laughter of Ares, but something different, quieter, deeper. I would close my eyes and find myself in a forest I did not know, surrounded by mist and whispering trees. Voices moved through the branches, not screaming, not accusing, but waiting, watching. Then came a name. I did not recognize it, but the sound of it struck something in me, something old, something buried. The name echoed in my mind long after I woke, though when I tried to repeat it aloud, the syllables dissolved on my tongue like smoke. The fates, perhaps, weaving a new thread, or unearthing one long hidden. Then came the signs, at first subtle, an unease in the divine court, whispers that quieted when I entered the hall, Hermes avoiding my gaze, Apollo's warmth dimming slightly as I passed. Even Athena, who had once been the only god to speak to me plainly, seemed more careful in her words. They had seen something, knew something, and they kept it from me. But I was no longer the soldier blindly following orders. I had walked through too much fire to ignore smoke. I began to move through Olympus with sharper eyes. I listened more, watched more, and what I saw disturbed me. Scrolls sealed with runes I could not read. Messengers dispatched at night. Gods gathered in private, speaking in tones that were too soft to hear, but too urgent to ignore. One night, I entered the Chamber of Visions, a place where the gods watched the mortal world and peered into its possibilities. It was rarely used. Too many truths in one place can unnerve even the divine. But I sat in silence before the scrying pool, and I opened my mind. What I saw was not the world below, but myself, standing not on Olympus but far from it. Snow fell in slow spirals around me. My armor was gone. My blades were different. And beside me a boy, not Calliope, someone else. His face was unclear, but his presence undeniable. He looked up at me, not with fear, not with worship, but with trust. And in his eyes, I saw a future I did not recognize, a future I had not asked for. The vision faded, but it did not leave me. Something was coming, something not born of Olympus, but not separate from it either. And the gods knew. They saw it in the threads of fate, and instead of preparing, they whispered. Instead of uniting, they hid. I returned to my throne, but I no longer sat with stillness. I kept my blades near, though I had not used them in years. The weight of them felt heavier than before, not because of their steel, but because I knew they would be called upon again. Olympus had never truly forgiven me, only tolerated me, and now, as the winds shifted and the fates turned their gaze, I felt it rising once more. Not vengeance, not wrath, but destiny, and destiny never arrives quietly. I began to walk Olympus again, not as a god among gods, but as a soldier among conspirators. My steps echoed in halls that once welcomed me. Now they seemed to recoil from my presence. Statues shifted in shadow. Divine fires flickered lower when I passed. I knew these were not accidents. The gods had never needed language to communicate their disapproval. I had once been their solution. Now I was their reminder. A mortal who had killed one of their own. A being who had risen not through faith or favor, but through fire and blood. And in their eyes I had climbed too far. Yet they did not speak openly against me. That would have required courage. And the gods are many things, petty, cruel, clever, but seldom brave when they fear one of their own. It was Athena who broke the silence first. She found me near the garden temples, where divine winds carried petals that never wilted and fountains sang with forgotten hymns. Her voice came quietly, not in command, but in caution. "Kratos," she said, "the others grow restless." I said nothing. She continued, "They see what stirs beneath the veil. They fear what it may awaken." I turned to her, the fire in my chest low but steady. "And what do you see, Athena?" Her gaze held mine, unwavering. "I see what you have become, and I see what you could become." She paused, as if weighing her words. "The fates do not show clear paths, only fractures. And your thread, it frays at both ends." I should have felt anger, resentment, but I felt only clarity. I had lived too long among gods to expect their loyalty. Their words were often riddles, their warnings veiled threats. But Athena, she had been different, not kind, not forgiving, but honest. And so I listened. "There are places in this world," she said, "where Olympus cannot see, where older laws govern. And in those places, something stirs." I narrowed my eyes. "The Titans are broken." She shook her head. "Older still." That word sat in my mind like a stone. Older than Titans, older than Olympus. I had heard whispers of such things, myths within myths, forces not born of light or chaos, but of what came before even memory. She gave me no more, only a name, the North, and with it a final warning. Should the winds turn, should the veil split, you must be ready, not as god, not as warrior, but as man. She left then, fading into golden mist, and I remained among the stone and flowers, feeling the world shift beneath my feet. Later that night, I stood on the balcony of my temple, looking down upon the mortal realm. Clouds moved strangely, too fast, too low. The stars above seemed dimmer. The wind did not howl. It whispered, and though no word could be made of it, the message was clear. Change was coming, and with it, judgment. I felt the blades of chaos stir at my back, not with hunger, but with recognition. They, too, remembered what it meant when the world began to hold its breath. And so did I. The silence that followed Athena's warning did not ease. Thickened, like a fog that refused to lift, it settled across Olympus, clinging to the golden spires and flawless halls. The other gods kept their distance, but their absence was louder than confrontation. I could feel their movements in the ether, discussions behind closed doors, plans etched into scrolls sealed with divine wax, words traded not in anger, but in preparation. I knew that feeling. I had lived among generals, walked in shadows before war. This was the quiet of strategy, not defense, but design. And though I did not yet know its shape, I felt its focus. Me, not the world below, not the chaos they feared would rise. Me. So I returned to the old places, the training grounds where I once sharpened my rage, the dark temples where I had knelt to Ares in chains of fire. I found them empty now, crumbling at the edges, left to dust and echo. Even Olympus forgets its history when it becomes inconvenient. But I remembered. I ran my fingers across old walls, saw my past etched in blood and ash, not in marble, not in song, but in memory. I stood where I had once fallen, where I had once begged, and I listened not to voices but to silence. It told me what the gods would not, that Olympus was shifting, that soon something would break. And when it did, I could not be here. Not as king, not as weapon, not as slave. One morning, before the sun crested the edge of the sky, I stood before my throne and looked at it for a long time. It was not cracked. It was not tarnished. It stood tall, carved from the same stone that had shaped the war god before me. But it no longer belonged to me, not because I feared it, not because I lacked the strength to rule from it, but because I understood what it truly meant, to sit upon it, to let its weight shape my purpose, to become what others expect you to be. I had already lived a life defined by another's vision. Ares's vision, Olympus's vision, no more. If the gods feared what stirred in the world beyond, they could guard their gates. But I would walk through them. I gathered no belongings. I left no word. Gods have no need for farewells. I stepped beyond the halls of Olympus in silence, the blades of chaos at my back, their heat steady, their weight familiar. The skies did not open. The stars did not fall. I walked down the long stair of clouds that few dared descend, and I did not look back. Olympus would watch. They always watched. But this time I did not walk as their servant. I walked as myself, a man made of ghosts, a god made of grief, a father whose legacy had not yet found its shape. I did not know then where I was going, only that I must go. The storm had not yet broken, but the wind had changed. Chapter 10. Ghosts never sleep. The road away from Olympus was not marked by fire or divine light. It was quiet, uneventful, as though the world itself refused to acknowledge the step I had taken. No gods called out to stop me. No storms rose to punish my defiance. I moved through valleys and mountains, far from marble and gold, into lands where my name carried neither reverence nor fear. And yet I was never truly alone. The silence followed me. It clung to my shoulders like the ash that once stained my skin, settling into every breath. It was not a silence born of peace. It was the hush that comes after ruin, the kind that lingers even when the fire has died. I walked with my eyes open and my fists relaxed, but inside I was listening for what I did not know, only that something was waiting. There were no temples in the places I wandered, no priests, no prayers, only the wind and the earth and the sky above, which stretched so wide I often felt I would fall into it. And perhaps that was what I needed. Distance. Not from Olympus. From myself. I did not seek vengeance now, nor forgiveness. I no longer believed in either. What I sought was something smaller. A moment. A breath. A place where the blades I carried would stop whispering. But even in the deepest woods, where the gods' eyes could not see, the whispers remained. Not loud. Not angry, just present, as if the spirits I had buried still walked a step behind me, waiting for me to speak their names, waiting to see if I still remembered. I did, every one, the villagers whose homes I burned, the soldiers I led to their deaths, the innocents caught beneath the banner of war, my wife, my daughter, the gods I struck down, and the god I had become. I remembered them not in guilt, but in truth. They were not mistakes. They were not victories. They were my story, and stories I had learned do not end. They echo. I sat by rivers that did not know my name and watched the water carry leaves toward places I could not see. I slept beneath trees that did not bend to my presence. And slowly, I began to feel something shift. Not in the world. In me, a space opening where rage had once lived, a space not yet filled, but waiting, like soil after fire, barren, but not dead. Sometimes I dreamed, but they were not the old dreams, not the screams, not the flames. These were quiet, a child's laughter, too faint to follow, footsteps behind me that did not threaten, a woman's voice, humming a song I could not remember. They left me restless, but not afraid. And that, I think, is where something began. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but breath. A moment where the world did not demand something of me. A moment where I did not have to kill or kneel or command. Just exist. It was small, fragile, but it was mine. And in that silence, I began to feel the pull not from Olympus, from the north, the same wind Athena had named, the same place the visions had shown me. I did not yet know its name. I did not yet know what waited, but I felt it calling, not with the urgency of prophecy or the fire of war, called with stillness, like the sound of a door opening far away, like the breath before a name is spoken. And I knew my journey was not over. I had not escaped fate. I had simply stepped off one path and onto another. I walked north, not because I knew where I was going, but because the wind told me to. Carried a different weight here, colder, but not bitter. It was the kind of cold that sharpened your senses, made you aware of your breath, your steps, the rhythm of your own heart. Trees grew taller, closer together. The ground changed from cracked dust to thick moss, soft beneath my feet. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, brushing my shoulders like the fingertips of something unseen. I did not shiver. I welcomed it. It covered the world in silence, but not the same silence I had carried from Olympus. This one was clean, new, the kind that comes before something is born, not after something has died. There were no roads here, no shrines, no signs left by the gods I had known. This was a land untouched by Olympus, untouched even by memory. And yet, as I moved deeper, I began to feel something familiar. Not in the air, but in my bones. A weight, not threatening, not cruel, simply old, ancient in a way that even the Titans could not claim. The trees creaked not from wind, but from age. The rocks bore carvings too worn to read. I passed ruins not built by men I had ever known, smaller, rounder, more primal. This land did not tell stories in marble. It whispered them in bark and frost. And still I kept walking. My blades remained wrapped in cloth across my back, their weight constant, but patient. I had not drawn them since leaving Olympus. I did not know if I ever would again, but I did not leave them behind. I could not. They were part of me now, same as the scar across my eye, the ash on my skin, the voice I no longer raised. I walked alone, but not unarmed. Not because I expected war, but because I knew peace was not mine to claim, not yet. My feet moved without thought, driven by something deeper than purpose. Current in the earth, a thread in the tapestry I could not see. And the farther I walked, the quieter my thoughts became. Sometimes I would stop, not to rest, but to listen. The forest here had a language all its own. It did not roar. It murmured. I heard the flap of distant wings, the scrape of claws on frozen bark, the rumble of something large beneath the snow. But nothing came for me. Nothing fled from me. This land did not know me. And in that ignorance, I felt something close to comfort. I was not Kratos here, not God, not monster. I was only a man moving through the trees, a man with scars too deep to heal, but also a man who still moved forward. One night I reached a river. It flowed slower than those in Greece, thick with meltwater and shadow. I knelt at its edge and looked into its surface. My reflection stared back, older, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much. I did not recognize the man in full, but for the first time I did not turn away. I watched him, and he watched me, and between us was not hatred, only stillness. I reached into the water and let it numb my fingers. The cold did not sting. It reminded me that I was still alive, still moving, and perhaps, if the wind continued to call, I might yet become something more than the sum of what I had broken. I stood, looked to the horizon. Snow fell heavier now, covering my tracks before I could see where they led. I did not fight it. The past had followed me long enough. Let the path ahead be hidden. Let it unfold as it must. I adjusted the cloth around my blades, took a breath, and stepped across the river. Not as God, not as ghost, but as a man walking into a new world. The forest grew denser as I pressed forward. Snow deepened beneath my feet, muffling each step until the world around me felt entirely still, like time had paused to watch. Branches creaked high above, laced with frost, swaying like slow breath in the cold sky. I moved without urgency. I had spent too much of my life rushing into war, into vengeance, into the arms of fate. Now each step was a choice, not a reaction. The cold did not slow me. It welcomed me, like a gatekeeper who did not judge, only observed. And though I carried weapons meant to kill gods, I walked with my hands open. There would be violence ahead, I did not doubt it. But for now, the land did not ask for blood. It asked only that I listen, and I did. At night, I rested beneath stone outcrops or the thick roots of old trees. I did not sleep deeply, never had, but the quiet here was different. Not empty, full, as though the land itself breathed beside me. In dreams, I still saw flashes. Faces I did not know, places I had not yet seen. A hammer striking wood. A voice, young, uncertain, asking questions I could not answer. Sometimes I heard my name, but not in accusation, as if the world itself was practicing how to say it gently. Kratos, not shouted, not cursed, just spoken, as if the wind was trying to remind me that I was still real. In those moments, I felt something begin to loosen. Not my past, not my guilt, but my grip on what I thought I had to be. For so long, I had been a blade, a tool of destruction. Even after I became a god, I wore the title like armor, convinced that it was all that remained of me. But now I saw something different. A fire can destroy, but it can also warm. A blade can kill, but it can also protect. And a man, even one as broken as I, can still choose what he becomes. The past does not vanish. The scars do not fade. But perhaps they can stop being open wounds. Perhaps they can become markers, proof that I survived. One morning, as the first light broke through the clouds, I reached the edge of a wide clearing. In the center stood a small wooden house. Smoke drifted lazily from its chimney. No divine glow, no thunder, just a home, simple, human. I stood at the edge of the trees and watched. I did not move closer, not yet, but I felt something shift in the air, like the moment just before a battle begins, only quieter, like something old had ended, and something new waited. I took a breath. The cold filled my lungs. I closed my eyes. I would not return to Olympus. I would not wear a crown again. My war was not over, but it was no longer the war they had written for me. What came next would not be vengeance. It would not be glory. It would be life. Hard, uncertain, earned. I opened my eyes and stepped forward, not toward war, not toward peace, but toward whatever lay ahead. The path ahead remains unwritten, but the man who once walked only in war now walks with something else. In silence, in memory, in choice. Thank you for staying with this story, for letting it drift through your mind like snow in a forest you've never seen. If this helped you rest, or helped you think, leave a like, a comment, or simply share the quiet with someone else. Part 2 of Kratos' journey, Fall of the Gods, is coming soon. Until then, sleep well, stay strong, and remember, even ghosts can find peace.